Wrong Target, a story in 3 parts. Part 1, the last thing he had left. There are towns in North Carolina
Let
that
go of
smell
me!
like rain before
You're
the clouds
coming with
even
us! I won't
Wilmington is one
go!
of them.
Just
Sawed
cooperate!
off the Cape Fear River diesel
This is
from the
it.
port
We hit 'em
and
tonight.
something older
Routes are
underneath
clear.
it
We're
all.
good to go.
Something
Perimeter
that
set. No
settles
surprise.
into the
Gear
wood
up.
of old
Copy that.
buildings and never quite leaves. On mornings like this, one gray and heavy and pressing down on everything like a hand on a shoulder, the town feels like it's holding its breath. Hank's Diner sits on the corner of Marsh Street and 4th, wedged between a hardware store that hasn't changed its window display since 2003 and a laundromat that hums through the night. The sign above the door has been missing the apostrophe in Hank's for 11 years. Nobody's fixed it. Nobody will. That's the kind of place it is. The bell above the door rings at 6:47 every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. Not approximately, not around that time, at 6:47, the staff knows it. The regulars know it. Even the cook, a broad-shouldered man named Pete, who communicates mostly in grunts and nods, knows to start the coffee at 6:44 so it's ready when the door opens. The man who comes through that door is named Bud Calloway. He is 72 years old. He walks with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has learned that his body requires negotiation rather than command a slight favor to the left hip, a hand that sometimes reaches for the counter's edge without him seeming to notice. His hair went white a long time ago, cut short and clean, the way military men tend to keep it long after the military is done with them. His face carries the kind of lines that come not just from age, but from weather, from sun and wind, and the particular strain of watching too many things happen that couldn't be undone. He wears the same jacket every morning, dark olive canvas exterior worn soft at the elbows. The kind of jacket that has stopped being a piece of clothing and becomes something else, an extension of the man, a second skin. On the left breast, slightly faded but still precise, is a unit patch from the 24th Infantry Division. He sits at the same stool, third from the left. The vinyl is cracked in a shape that has conformed to him over years of use, and he lowers himself into it with something that is not quite a sigh, more like the sound of a man arriving somewhere he is allowed to rest. Pete brings the coffee without being asked. The waitress, a woman named Carol, who has worked at Hank's for 22 years, and has the sharp, affectionate practicality of someone who has seen everything twice, sets down a small creamer and 2 sugars. She doesn't say good morning yet. She's learned that Bud needs 2 minutes before he's ready for words. He wraps both hands around the mug, closes his eyes for just a moment. Outside, the rain makes the street look like old film. Everything slightly softened, the colors muted, the edges of things bleeding into each other. Bud watches it the way he watches most things now, from a slight remove, as though the glass between him and the world is thicker than it used to be. Not unhappiness, exactly. Just the particular distance that accumulates in a life when the people who kept you tethered to the present, who called you back from the interior spaces you retreated to, are no longer there. Margaret used to say he lived too much inside his own head. She said it with the affectionate exasperation of a woman who had loved a quiet man for 38 years, and had made a separate peace with the parts of him that would never fully surface. He misses her in the way you miss a season, not always consciously, not always with grief, but as a persistent background awareness of absence. The way you notice winter has ended, not because of a single warm day, but because something in the light has changed. This is the whole of his morning routine. This is on many days the whole of his social world. Bud Calloway lives alone in a house on Oleander Drive that he and his wife Margaret bought in 1987. Margaret died 6 years ago, a Tuesday in March, which is why Tuesdays are harder than other days, though Bud would not tell you that if you asked. His children are grown and scattered. A son in Denver who calls on birthdays and Christmas, sometimes Thanksgiving. A daughter in Portland who means well and sends cards with long handwritten notes that Bud reads carefully and keeps in a drawer in the kitchen. He is not estranged from them. They are not unkind. Life simply moved them in directions that carried them far from Wilmington, and the distance between good intentions and presence is one of the quieter cruelties of growing old. He does not complain about this. Men of his generation, men shaped by certain experiences, tend not to. On this particular Tuesday morning in November, while Bud Calloway stares into his coffee and Carol moves between tables with the efficient grace of long practice, the back booth of Hank's Diner is occupied by 15 people who should, by any reasonable expectation, make the other customers nervous. They are big, most of them. They wear leather heavy black jackets with patches that announce allegiances and histories most civilians can't fully read. Their bikes are parked outside in a row that stretches half the block chrome, catching what little light the gray morning offers. They arrived 20 minutes ago, coming in from the cold with the comfortable familiarity of people who know this place, and Pete had nodded from the kitchen window in a way that meant something like acknowledgement, like recognition. They are loud in the way that groups of people with shared history are loud, not aggressive, just present, filling space with the particular ease of people who have stopped worrying about whether they belong somewhere. Their leader sits at the center of the back booth. Her name is Vic Decker. She is 45 years old, though she carries it differently than most people do. Not younger looking exactly, but harder looking in the way that metal is harder than wood, a density that comes from being tested and not breaking. Her dark hair is pulled back. Her jacket, like the others, is heavy black leather, but hers has a quality of authority to it, worn the way a uniform is worn by someone who has earned the right to wear it. On the back above the chapter patch is a name that the others in the crew say with a particular weight, Vic. She got the name young and kept it through everything that followed. For the leather, before the bikes, before the 15 people who would follow her into anything, Vic Decker was a paramedic. 8 years on the road in Wilmington, working nights, mostly pulling people back from the edge of things with her hands and her training, and a particular quality of calm that comes from learning to think clearly when everything around you is chaos. She was good at it. She was very good at it. She left after Dale. Her brother, Sergeant Dale Decker, died in Fallujah in November 2004. He was 28. He had been in the Army since he was 19, had done 2 tours before the one that killed him, and had been put in for a commendation that was still processing through channels when the notification came. The commendation was never finalized. The medal was never awarded. The paperwork somewhere in the machinery of the military bureaucracy simply stopped moving. Vic never talked about this, not to her crew, not to the few people she let close. She carried it the way her brother had carried his rifle, always present, always ready, never drawn unless necessary. What she did talk about occasionally when the conversation required, it was the leaving. 8 years on the road, and then one morning she simply did not go back. Not a dramatic exit, no speech, no scene. She had handed in her equipment and signed the paperwork and driven away from the station without looking back. And the woman who had spent 8 years pulling people back from the edges of things had spent the months that followed figuring out who she was when she wasn't doing that anymore. The bikes came gradually, then the crew, then the chapter. It was not an escape. She had examined that possibility carefully and dismissed it. It was instead a translation. The one in front is lean with a jawline tight from clenching and a way of standing that takes up more space than his frame should require. His name, though nobody in the diner knows this yet, is Cody Reese. Behind him 2 others, one broad and slow-looking one, wiry with a nervous energy that makes him seem like he's vibrating slightly even when still. They come in and they stand for a moment near the door, and something in the quality of their presence makes Pete look up from the grill, and Carol pause mid-step, and 2 customers in the corner booth go very still. Bud Calloway does not look up. He is deep in his coffee, deep in whatever Tuesday morning thoughts occupy the private interior of a man who has learned to live mostly inside himself. This is the moment. This is the hinge on which everything turns. Cody Reese looks across the diner. He sees the register behind the counter, sees Carol, sees the geometry of a space that might or might not have an exit strategy built into it. Then his eyes move and they find Bud, find the wallet sitting on the counter beside the coffee mug thick enough to be visible, sitting there with the carelessness of a man who has never needed to be suspicious about his surroundings in this particular place. The plan changes in an instant. The register is complicated. The old man at the counter is not. They move. It happens in the space between heartbeats. Cody comes in fast from the left. The broad one circles wide. The wiry one stays near the door watching. Cody's hand closes on the wallet before Bud has fully processed that someone is standing beside him, and the shove comes immediately after hard from behind a hand flat against Bud's shoulder blade, sending him back and off the stool. Bud grabs the counter edge. His grip holds for a moment, the grip of a man who once held on to things in conditions that would have broken most people, but there's ice in the shoulder that has never fully recovered from 1991, and his fingers slip. He goes down, not hard, not the falling of a man badly hurt, but down knees on the tile, one hand catching the edge of the stool, the breath going out of him in a short surprise sound. And as he goes down, something falls from inside his jacket. Something small wrapped in an old piece of olive cloth tied with a bootlace that has been retied so many times the knot has its own particular shape. It hits the tile and slides. Cody Reese is already moving, already scooping wallet in one hand, the cloth bundle in the other, not even looking at it, stuffing everything into his jacket pocket. Because you take everything you sorted out later, you don't stop to examine what you've grabbed when you're grabbing. From the back booth, Vic Decker is already standing. This is worth noting. Not one of the 15 people rose first. Not Garrett Briggs, her second, who is bigger and faster than most people give him credit for. Not Dex Malone, who spent 6 years as a bouncer and has reflexes built for exactly this kind of moment. Vic was on her feet before the shove had fully landed, before Bud had hit the floor. Something in the quality of those three men's entrance had registered in the part of her brain that 8 years of emergency medicine had trained to read threat the way other people read text. She moves like someone who has stopped thinking and is operating on something older and more reliable than thought. 3 strides past the tables, past Carol, who has pressed herself against the back wall, past Pete, who has appeared in the kitchen window holding a spatula like it might be useful. The 2 men still standing see her coming, and they go out the door fast, the wiry one already through before she reaches the counter. Cody is a step behind them. He shoves Bud one more time as he passes. Not necessary, just mean the shove of someone asserting something, and then he's through the door and into the rain. Vic hits the doorway 2 seconds later. She stands on the wet sidewalk, rain coming down cold and steady, and she looks left, right, left again. The street is empty of them. Between parked cars and alleys, in the general gray chaos of a November morning, 3 men have simply ceased to be visible. She takes 6 steps to the corner. Nothing. Takes 4 steps the other direction. Nothing. She stands in the rain for a moment longer than she needs to. Her jaw is tight. Her hands loose at her sides are not quite fists, something more controlled than fists, the deliberate relaxation of a person who has learned to manage what she carries. Then she turns and goes back inside. Bud is on the floor still, not because he can't get up. He's braced against the counter, one knee raised in the position of a man who is technically capable of standing, but has found in this moment that standing requires a kind of intention he doesn't currently have access to. His face is pale. His breath comes in shallow increments. He is not injured in any way that would show up on an X-ray. But something in him has broken. Not bones, not the exterior architecture of a man who has survived worse than this. Something interior. Something in the place where dignity lives, where the self-concept of a man who has faced harder things than 3 young thugs in a diner, that place has taken a hit that the body's inventory doesn't capture. Vic crosses the diner in measured steps. She doesn't rush now. She has read the situation, the threat is gone. What remains is different. She crouches beside him, and she doesn't reach for him, doesn't try to pull him up, doesn't do any of the things that would make this about her helping and him being helped. She simply goes to his level. She has done this before. Not in diners, but in doorways, in the aftermath of accidents, in the particular terrible quiet that follows the loud part of a crisis. She knows what this moment requires. It requires presence. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to be with someone in the worst minute of their morning without trying to fix it faster than it can be fixed. You hurt anywhere. Her voice is low, professional in its calm but not cold. Bud shakes his head. His hands are pressed flat against the tile floor. Take your time. He does. Around them, the diner has gone very still. Carol stands at the back wall, hand over her mouth. The customers in the corner booth haven't moved. Pete has disappeared from the kitchen window, but the sounds of the grill have also stopped, which means he's listening. Outside, 2 of Vic's crew stand at the door, Garrett and Dex positioned, not threateningly but present, the way large men with a particular history position themselves when something has happened that might not be finished yet. The others have spread through the diner with a quiet efficiency that has no theatrics to it. Someone has righted Bud's stool. Someone has retrieved his coffee mug from where it slid down the counter. Someone Vic does not see who has already picked up the scattered items from around Bud's stool and placed them carefully on the counter. Keys, a faded photograph, a folded piece of paper that might be a letter, but not the cloth bundle. Vic sees the empty space on the counter where it should be. She sees Bud's eyes go there as he finally pushes himself upright, sees the way his hand reaches automatically for his jacket pocket and finds it empty, sees the color change in his face, not the pale of shock, but something grayer, something closer to the color of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of what has happened. She doesn't say anything yet. She helps him back onto his stool with a hand at his elbow, not more than he needs, not less, and she stays standing beside him while Carol brings water without being asked and sets it down with the careful movement of someone trying very hard to be useful. The photograph on the counter catches Vic's eye for a moment. It's old, the colors slightly wash, the edges soft with handling. Two men in desert fatigue squinting into a sun she can't see, both young. He doesn't say anything, just sets a fresh cup of coffee in front of Bud and steps back. It's the kind of gesture that doesn't announce itself, doesn't require acknowledgement. It's simply there. The silence in the diner has changed quality. It started as the silence of shock, of people holding breath. Now it's something different. The particular quiet of a space in which people are deciding what kind of place this is, deciding whether to stay or leave, deciding whether what just happened is still happening or whether it's done. Bud Calloway looks at the fresh coffee. He looks at the space on the counter where his hand keeps returning, finding nothing. He looks at the photograph and something in his face shifts, not much, barely a degree, the way the needle on a compass shifts when you get close to something magnetic. "My Purple Heart," he says. The words come out quiet, almost conversational, as if he's simply noting a fact, making an observation the way a man might note that it looks like more rain. But the words land in the silence of the diner like something dropped from a great height. Vic is absolutely still. Around her, the crew, every single one of the 15 people who came in from the cold this morning and asked for eggs and coffee and occupied the back booth with their noise and their leather and their particular brand of presence, every one of them hears it. And the room, which was already quiet, becomes a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight. There is a man at the far end of the back booth who served 2 years in the Army National Guard before a knee injury ended it. There is a woman near the door who lost an uncle in the Gulf. There is a young man, Brixton, who enlisted out of high school on an impulse he still can't fully explain and came home 3 years later to a world that had moved on without him. None of them speak. None of them need to. The words have landed, and each person in the room is receiving them in whatever private interior space those words fit. "Tommy's name is on the back," Bud says, and his voice is steady, is controlled, is the voice of a man who has learned to speak about unbearable things in bearable registers. "He never made it home. From Kuwait, 1991. He pauses. "It was the only thing I had left that had his name on it." Vic does not let herself feel this yet. There is a discipline to that. She learned it in 8 years of emergency medicine, the necessity of keeping the feeling in a separate room until the crisis is managed. She will feel it later. Right now, she files it in the part of her where certain things are stored, the things that matter, and she keeps her face steady and her voice level. She knows about Desert Storm. She knows the 24th Infantry Division has seen the patch on his jacket every morning, though she has never spoken to him before today. She knows the rough mathematics of a man his age, that patch, that war. She knows what a Purple Heart costs. She knows because her brother Dale was put in for a commendation in 2004 that was never awarded because the paperwork stopped moving and nobody with the right authority cared enough to start it again, and the medal that should have had his name on it never existed. She has carried that particular knowledge for 20 years in the specific way you carry things that have no resolution, not with anger anymore, just with the weight of the fact of it. She does not say any of this to Bud Calloway. She says, "We'll get it back." He looks at her, really looks at her, taking in the jacket, the patches, the 15 people occupying the back half of his regular diner, the general profile of a person who is by most standard assessments not the kind of person who makes promises like this one. "You don't have to do that," he says. "I know." She meets his eyes. "We'll get it back." There is a pause in which several things happen simultaneously. Bud Calloway, who has lived long enough and hard enough to recognize the difference between a thing said because it sounds right and a thing said because it's true, recognizes which one this is. Something in him that has been braced since he hit the floor releases just slightly, just enough to be visible if you're paying the right kind of attention. Vic straightens, turns to the room. 15 people are already watching her, already reading whatever is in her posture. Garrett, she says, talk to Pete. Get the security camera footage from outside, whatever they have. She looks at Dex. I want a description written down from everyone who saw them clearly. All three. She looks at the corner booth. You two, did either of you see which direction they went? The couple in the corner booth blink. They were not expecting to be asked anything. They were, in fact, hoping to become invisible. But one of them, the man 50s reading glasses pushed up on his head, nods slowly. They went left on 4th, he says. I was watching through the window. They got into a dark blue car, parked halfway up the block. Make, model. I don't know cars. He pauses. It was old, square looking. Dex is already writing. Carol, the waitress, finding solid ground in the familiar, refills Bud's coffee without asking and tops up the waters at the corner booth and generally begins moving through the diner in a way that suggests things are returning to something like order. Though the coffee she pours into Bud's mug is very slightly overfull because her hands are not entirely steady. Vic goes through the diner's front window with her phone photographing the street, the alley mouth across the way, the position of cars. She photographs the angle of the security camera mounted above the door of the hardware store next door. She photographs the entrance to Hank's from the outside. She works with the methodical precision of someone who knows what evidence is, who has learned to document the aftermath of bad things, because documentation is the beginning of making them mean something. When she comes back in, she crosses to where Bud sits and she stays standing, but she puts her hand briefly on the counter beside his, not on his hand, just near it, just establishing proximity. We're going to need to know anything you can tell us about those three, she says. Anything you noticed. Height, age, any distinguishing features. I know it happened fast. Bud nods. He has recovered, visibly. The color has come back to his face. The shallowness has left his breathing. He has not recovered from everything. Not from the thing the cloth bundle represented, in the absence it has left, but he has recovered enough to be useful. The one who grabbed my wallet, he says slowly, had a tattoo on the right side of his neck. Looked old, faded. Something geometric, could have been a compass, could have been something else. He pauses, eyes moving in the careful way of someone searching their own memory. He was maybe 25, light eyes, moved like somebody who'd done something like that before, like it wasn't the first time. Vic is watching him as he talks, not just listening, watching. There is something in the way Bud describes the young man that catches in her. Not with anger, not with the heat of a man who wants revenge, but with something more complicated. A kind of sad recognition, as if he is seeing something in Cody Reese that he can identify from a distance. She files this too. What's your name, she asks, though she realizes she probably should have asked this first. Bud Calloway. Vic Decker. She doesn't offer her hand immediately. I'm going to need your phone number, Bud, so we can keep you informed. Is that all right? He looks at her for a moment. You're going to actually do this? Yes. Why? The question sits in the air between them. Around them, the crew is working, talking to Carol, talking to Pete, gathering what can be gathered from this morning. Outside, rain continues to fall on Marsh Street and 4th, on the line of motorcycles still patient at the curb on the alley, where three young men have disappeared into the gray November morning. Vic could give him a number of answers. She could tell him about community, about the kind of code that makes certain things non-negotiable. She could tell him about Desert Storm and the 24th Infantry and the particular respect that runs, sometimes unexpectedly, between people who understand what service costs. She doesn't say any of those things. She says because it's right, and somehow that is more convincing than anything more elaborate would have been. Bud gives her his number. She puts it in her phone and then, without being asked, gives him hers. They sit like that for a moment, two people on either side of a counter in a diner that smells like coffee and rain, connected now by something that neither of them fully anticipated when they woke up this morning. Outside, she hears the first engine turn over, then another, then another. By the time she walks out the front door of Hank's Diner, 12 more engines have joined the first, and the sound of them fills Marsh Street in a way that the rain cannot diminish, low and steady, and purposeful, the sound of something decided. She stands on the sidewalk for a moment before getting on her bike. She doesn't look back through the window. She doesn't need to. But inside, Bud Calloway watches them go. He watches the motorcycles pull out one by one into the gray morning, watches them merge into traffic and disappear in both directions, watches until the sound of the engines fades into the general noise of the city. Then he looks down at his coffee. It's cold now. Carol materializes beside him and replaces it without a word. He wraps his hands around the new mug, closes his eyes. There is an emptiness on the left side of his chest in the inside pocket of the olive jacket, where a small cloth bundle wrapped in a bootlace has lived for 33 years. The absence of it has a physical quality like a missing tooth that the tongue keeps finding. He knows what's inside the cloth without needing to think about it. The specific weight of the metal, the slight roughness of the ribbon, the engraved letters on the back that he has traced with his thumb in the dark of 100 nights in the years since Kuwait. THOMSAWHEELER. Tommy Wheeler, who was 23 years old in January of 1991, who had a younger sister in Tulsa and a girlfriend he was going to marry, and a way of laughing that filled whatever space he was in. Tommy Wheeler, who threw himself between Bud and an incoming blast that Bud never saw coming, who made a decision in a fraction of a second that Bud has spent 33 years trying to make worth something. He is not going to cry in Hank's diner. He has not cried in public since Margaret's funeral. And that was a different category of grief, the grief that has a name and a shape and a socially recognized form. This is something else. This is the specific grief of a thing taken. He drinks his coffee and he stares at the street, and he does not cry. What he does very quietly in the privacy of his own chest is believe her. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know Vic Decker from anyone. He doesn't know the 15 people in leather jackets who swept through his morning and swept back out of it. He has no rational basis for the feeling that settles into him as the sound of the engines finally disappears entirely. But he has lived long enough to know the difference between people who say things and people who mean them, and he has spent enough time in the company of people for whom a commitment made is a commitment kept to recognize that quality when he encounters it. She meant it. He finishes his coffee, sets the mug down, looks at the photograph that someone retrieved and placed carefully on the counter. He pockets it, slides it into the inside of his jacket, into the space where the cloth bundle should be, where the absence of it is loudest. He puts on his jacket, nods to Carol, leaves $3 on the counter the way he does every morning. He walks out into the rain. The wet hits him immediately cold and steady, the kind of November rain that doesn't rush but doesn't stop. He stands on the sidewalk outside Hank's diner for a moment, his hand in the inside pocket of the olive jacket pressing against the space where the cloth bundle should be. The space where Tommy Wheeler's name should be. He has carried that metal through surgeries and funerals and the slow, ordinary erosion of decades. He has carried it through Margaret's diagnosis and Margaret's death, and the long, empty years since touching it in the dark way you touch something that tethers you to a story that mattered, a story that proves you were not always the man you've become, diminished by time and loss, in the particular solitude of outliving too many people. He takes his hand out of the empty pocket. Behind him, Hank's diner slowly fills back in with the sounds of itself, the grill, the conversation, the particular hum of a place returning to ordinary time after an extraordinary interruption. But something has changed, something small and not visible, like a gear that has shifted one tooth over, or a compass needle that has found a new north, something that will not shift back. Somewhere across the city, in the space between parked cars and rain-gray alleys, 3 young men are counting cash and not yet understanding what else they took. And on her bike heading east on 4th Street, Vic Decker rides into the rain with her jaw set and her hands steady on the handlebars, and the name Thomas A. Wheeler sitting in the new and particular place where certain things are stored, the things that matter, the things that will not be let go of. She thinks about Dale. She thinks about the medal that was never awarded, the paperwork that stopped moving, the commendation that exists nowhere except in the records of things that should have happened and didn't. She thinks about what it costs a person to carry something for 33 years, what it costs to have it taken. She rides. The rain comes down on Wilmington, on the Cape Fear River, on the hardware store, and the laundromat and the diner with the broken apostrophe in its sign. It comes down on 15 motorcycles spreading out through the city in different directions. It comes down on an old man walking slowly to his truck, one hand in an empty jacket pocket. It comes down on whatever is coming next. Part 2. The Patience of Wolves. The city doesn't stop for anyone's grief. That's the first thing you learn. When you've worked enough emergencies, the world keeps its rhythm regardless of what has broken inside the small, human spaces within it. Traffic moves, businesses open. The rain that fell on Tuesday morning in Wilmington dries by Wednesday afternoon, leaving the streets with that particular post-rain clarity where everything looks slightly more itself than usual. Edges, sharpened colors deepen the ordinary world, briefly extraordinary in its ordinariness. Vic Decker did not sleep much Tuesday night. She sat in the clubhouse, a converted garage on the industrial edge of town that smelled like motor oil and old leather, and the particular accumulated residue of years of people being honest with each other in a space where honesty was the only currency that mattered, and she laid out what she knew on the long table in the center of the room. What she knew was not much. Three men, one named or nicknamed something beginning with C, according to a contact Dex had already put out feelers to by Tuesday afternoon. A dark blue car, old square, no make or model. A neck tattoo geometric faded. A purple heart belonging to a man named Bud Calloway, 72, formerly of the 24th Infantry Division Desert Storm, 1991. The medal engraved on the back with the name of a dead man. The crew sat around her in various states of alertness. Garrett on a stool near the wall, arms crossed, saying nothing but present, in the complete way that large men with good instincts are present. Dex with a map of Wilmington spread on the corner of the table, already marked with concentric circles radiating out from Hank's Diner. Four others at the far end, two of them on phones. The rest distributed through the space with the easy informality of people who have spent enough time together that silence between them has no friction. "We start with pawn shops," Vic said. Not loudly. She never needed to speak loudly in this room. "Every shop within 5 miles of the diner. Then we expand. Garrett, I need you on the east side. There are 3 shops between Market Street and the port that move merchandise fast. Dex, you're covering everything north of Oleander." She paused. "I'll handle the west side personally." "Why personally?" Dex asked. Not challenging, just asking. "Because I know how to have a conversation that doesn't sound like an interrogation." She looked at him steadily. "You're better at the docks. Use that." Dex nodded. This was the thing about working for Vic. She knew what she was and she knew what everyone else was, and she deployed those things with a precision that never felt like management. It felt like trust. "We're not threatening anyone," Vic continued. "We're not breaking anything. We ask questions. We show the photo." She held up her phone on the screen, an image pulled from a military archive, the specific model of Purple Heart, awarded in 1991, the ribbon, the profile of Washington on the obverse. "We document everything we hear. We keep Bud informed. And if we find a solid lead, we bring it to someone who can do something official with it before we do anything ourselves." One of the younger members, a man called Brixton, who had been with the chapter less than a year, shifted his weight. "What if they have already sold it? What if it's gone?" The room went quiet in a particular way. Not uncomfortable, just attentive. "Then we follow where it went," Vic said, "until we find it." There was no further discussion of the possibility of failure. They moved out the next morning in the gray Wednesday light fanning out through Wilmington's secondary economy, the pawn shops and flea markets, and informal networks of exchange that exist in every city beneath the surface of the visible commercial world. Vic worked the west side alone, walking into each shop with the relaxed confidence of someone who buys and sells regularly, asking her questions in the unhurried way of a person with no particular urgency, showing the photo on her phone with the casual manner of someone showing a picture of their dog. The first shop turned up, nothing. The owner, a thin man who watched her with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to assess risk quickly, shook his head at the photo and went back to his inventory. The second shop was more promising. A woman behind the counter who recognized the general description of Cody, but couldn't place a specific visit, who offered the kind of vague, maybe that experienced investigators learn to read as a probable yes, spoken by someone who prefers not to be involved. In the third shop, she visited a place on Castle Street, run by a man named Piper, who had operated there for 20 years and had the careful neutrality of someone who has learned to see everything and remember selectively. She got the first flicker. "Had a kid in yesterday morning," Piper said, studying the photo of the medal. He spoke slowly in the manner of a man who measures his words against the possibility of future inconvenience. "Young, nervous, Had a watch he wanted to move some jewelry. I turned him away. Items looked too recent if you follow me. Did he have anything else with him? Piper looked at her for a long moment, reading her. He had a bag, kept it close, didn't open it in front of me. He paused. Asked me about other buyers, places that don't ask too many questions. And you told him, another long pause. I may have mentioned a name. The name he mentioned was Eddie Voss. Vic had heard of Eddie Voss the way you hear of weather patterns as a feature of the local environment that you navigate around rather than engage with directly. He ran a fencing operation out of a warehouse in the Port District, had done so for the better part of a decade, and had survived that long through a combination of careful operation and connections that reached into places where scrutiny came to die. He was not violent by reputation. He was something more durable than violent. He was useful to people who preferred to remain unnamed, which made him very difficult to move against through conventional means. Vic thanked Piper, did not give him her name, walked out into the Castle Street morning and called Garrett. Get me everything you can find on Eddie Voss, she said, not from the internet, from people. By Thursday afternoon, she had a picture. Garrett's contacts accumulated over years of moving through the city's various strata, produced a portrait of Voss that was more complex than the simple fence operation suggested. He was 50 years old, had done 2 years in federal prison in his 30s for receiving stolen property, and had emerged from that experience with a more sophisticated understanding of how to avoid repetition. His warehouse was clean in the technical sense, inventory documented, plausible provenance, established for most items, relationships maintained with sufficient legal buffer to make prosecution difficult. But there was something else. Dex found it through a dock worker named Pruitt, who drank at a bar near the waterfront and talked when the right questions were asked in the right order over the right number of beers. Eddie Voss, Pruitt said, had recently acquired something he was not moving, something he was sitting on. This was unusual. Voss moved merchandise fast. That was his value to the people who used him. When Voss held something back, it meant the item had a different kind of value than cash. It meant it was leverage. Vic sat with this information in the clubhouse on Thursday evening, the map in front of her, Garrett and Dex on either side. The rest of the crew went about its evening. Someone was cooking. Someone was working on a bike. The sounds of ordinary club life moved through the garage around them. He knows what it is, Garrett said. He was not asking. He knows what it is, Vic agreed, so why hold it? It's not like a Purple Heart is worth. It's not about what it's worth, Vic said. It's about what it proves. She had spent most of Thursday making calls, working contacts, pulling at threads that connected Eddie Voss to the broader landscape of Wilmington's power structure. What she found piece by careful piece was a thread that led somewhere unexpected. Warren Pell was 63 years old and running for the United States Senate from North Carolina on a platform built substantially on his record of military support, his years of veterans advocacy, his carefully maintained image as a man who understood and honored those who served. He was currently ahead in the polls by 4 points and had momentum. He had also in the early 1990s served as a procurement officer in the Gulf War theater, in a capacity that, according to certain documents that had never quite surfaced in the right places, had involved the mishandling of casualty records. Specifically, the records of men wounded or killed whose injuries and circumstances were documented in ways that served administrative convenience rather than factual accuracy. Men whose commendations were delayed, denied, or simply lost in the machinery of a system that had more pressing things to attend to. The 24th Infantry Division, Kuwait, 1991. Vic stared at this information for a long time. Bud Calloway's Purple Heart was not just a medal, it was potentially documentation, physical evidence tied to a specific incident, a specific date, a specific set of circumstances that connected directly to the period when Warren Pell had been in a position to influence which records moved and which ones didn't. Eddie Voss, who was the kind of man who developed and maintained useful relationships with useful people, had somehow understood this, had held the medal back from the flow of ordinary commerce because it was worth more as a card in a private game than as a transaction. She called Bud Thursday night. He answered on the second ring, which told her he had been waiting. "We have a lead," she said. "It's early, but it's real. I wanted you to know." A pause. "What kind of lead?" "The kind that takes time to follow correctly." She hesitated, then decided he had earned more than that. "The man who may have your medal, he's not just a fence. He's connected to things that make this more complicated than a simple theft. Another pause. Longer this time. You don't have to tell me everything. I know. She was quiet for a moment. How are you doing, Bud? The question seemed to catch him off guard. She heard a small sound that might have been a breath, might have been something else. I keep reaching for my pocket, he said finally. Every few minutes, all day. Like my hand doesn't know yet. She knew about that. The body's memory running ahead of or behind the mind's acceptance of a new reality. We're going to find it, she said. I believe you, he said. In the plainness of it, the absence of qualifications sat with her after she hung up in a way that plain things sometimes do. Friday morning, Vic went to see Russ Hauer. She had known Hauer for 6 years, had met him through circumstances she didn't discuss in detail, a situation involving a crew member, and a misunderstanding that could have gone several different ways and had gone the right way, partly because of Russ Hauer's particular brand of careful, unhurried judgment. He was 58, former FBI, now technically retired, but functionally available to certain situations that required someone who understood evidence chains and legal exposure and the precise mechanics of building a case that would hold. He ran in the mornings along the river path, which is where she met him. He didn't seem surprised to see her leaning against the railing at his usual stopping point, though he couldn't have known she was coming. Vic, he said, breathing steady from the run. Russ. She handed him a coffee she'd brought. He accepted it without comment. She told him everything, not quickly, carefully, in the order that made the shape of it clear. The robbery at the diner, Bud Calloway, the Purple Heart and what it represented, Eddie Voss and his unusual decision to hold the item rather than move it, the thread that led to Warren Pell and the Gulf War records. Hauer listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she valued about him, his capacity to simply receive information without inserting himself into it. When she finished, he looked at the river for a moment. Voss is protected, he said. I know. Pell has people in the county DA's office, possibly in the federal building too. I'd need to check the current assignment roster. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. A search warrant for Voss's warehouse based on what you have would go through local channels first. Local channels are not safe for this. So how do we do it right? We build a case that's clean enough to go federal from the start. That means documentation, chain of custody on every piece of evidence you've gathered. Signed statements, not just notes. He looked at her. And it means time. This doesn't move fast. How long? As long as it takes to do it correctly. He paused. If we rush it, it falls apart. If it falls apart, Voss walks and the metal disappears, and Pell uses the collapse of the case to insulate himself further. You understand that she understood it. She didn't like it, but she understood it. I'll keep gathering, she said. You start building. Hauer nodded slowly. One more thing. Vic. He met her eyes. Keep your crew out of that warehouse. Whatever happens, whatever you find out, nobody goes near Voss's operation directly. The moment this becomes a biker crew intimidating a witness, it's over. She had already known this, but she nodded. The saying of it out loud had its own value. She rode back through the Friday morning city past the hardware store and the laundromat past Hank's diner, where the lights were on, and Carol was probably already moving between tables. She did not stop. The envelope appeared on Saturday. Bud called her at 10 in the morning, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has received information and is still in the process of deciding what to do with it. She was at his house on Oleander Drive in 18 minutes. The envelope was plain manila. No return address. Inside, $500 in mixed bills and a handwritten note on lined paper, the handwriting careful in the way of someone who doesn't write by hand often. Sorry for the trouble. Consider this compensation. No hard feelings. Vic read it twice. Set it down on Bud's kitchen table. The kitchen was exactly what she would have expected, clean and slightly sparse. The kitchen of a man who eats because he has to, more than because he wants to, the refrigerator covered with photographs, and a child's drawing that was old enough to have been made by a grandchild who was now probably in high school. A coffee maker that was clearly used constantly. A single chair at the kitchen table. Don't touch it anymore, she said, or the envelope. Is it evidence? It's whoever sent it admitting they know what they took and that they want this to go away. She pulled out her phone and photographed the note, the envelope, the bills. They're scared, which means they're paying attention to what we're doing. Bud looked at the money on the table. Maybe I should just, no. She said it without heat, without drama, just a fact. That's not compensation, Bud. That's a number they've assigned to what you carried for 33 years. To Tommy Wheeler's name on a piece of metal. She looked at him steadily. It's an insult dressed up as an apology. Something moved in his face. He nodded slowly once. She bagged the envelope and its contents, carefully labeled it with the date and time, and took it to Hauer that afternoon. Hauer examined it with the careful attention of a man who has processed a great deal of evidence over a career and knows which details are significant. Fingerprints on the bills are probably useless, he said. Cash changes too many hands. But the notepaper handwriting, the specific phrasing. He looked up. This helps Vic. This is someone confirming involvement. Can you trace who sent it? I can try my... He set the bag down. This also tells me they know you're looking, which means someone talked. One of your contacts, one of the pawn shop owners, someone along the chain. She had already considered this. Voss has eyes in the secondary market. It's how he sources his inventory. So he knows you're closing in. Hauer was quiet for a moment. Be careful. She was already being careful, but she understood what he meant. The tires were slashed on Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the robbery. Vic walked out to her bike in the early light and found the front tire split clean, not a puncture, but a deliberate cut, the kind made with a blade and intention. She stood looking at it for a moment, then crouched down and ran her finger along the gash. She pulled out her phone and called Garrett. Check your bike. Check everyone's. By noon, 4 bikes had been hit. Garrett's rear tire, 2 others in their driveways across the city. The message was not subtle. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be readable, and it was readable. She called the crew together that evening. They came in quiet, which was unusual. Normally, there was noise to an evening meeting. The overlap of conversations. The ambient sounds of a group that has been moving through the world all day. Tonight, they came in with a particular kind of stillness. The stillness of people who have been told something by a slashed tire and are deciding how they feel about being told it. Vic stood at the center of the room. She didn't pace. She stood. Document everything, what she said. Your bike, your property, anything that's been touched. Photos with timestamps. Get repair estimates in writing. We are building a harassment case that runs parallel to the main case. She looked around the room slowly. Nobody goes near Voss. Nobody makes contact. Nobody drives past the warehouse. Nobody sends messages through mutual contacts. Nothing. So we just absorb it, Brixton said, the same young one who had asked about failure the week before. We absorb it, and we document it, and we hand it to Hauer, and we let it become another nail in a case that is going to close around Ed D. Voss, whether he slashes tires or not. She held his gaze. What he's doing is trying to make us make a mistake. The moment we respond the way he expects people like us to respond, we've given him what he wants. We lose the case. We lose the medal. Bud gets nothing. Silence. Any questions? None. The harassment continued through the week. A brick through the clubhouse window at 2 in the morning. Vic was the one who photographed it in the yellow flashlight beam. The glass spread across the concrete floor, the brick sitting in the middle of it with the particular stillness of an object that has been weaponized and is now simply an object again. She photographed it and she filed a report and she sent everything to Hauer. On Thursday, someone spray painted the side of the garage door with a message she didn't repeat to Bud when she called him that evening. She photographed it and painted over it with 2 coats of gray, and then she stood outside in the cold evening air for a moment with the paint roller in her hand, looking at the blank wall. She thought about Dale, not the way she usually thought about him, the controlled, managed way that grief becomes when you've had 20 years to build the structures that contain it. She thought about him the way she sometimes did late at night when the structures came down a little, the specific person of him, the way he had of laughing, that was like their father's laugh, the letters he wrote from overseas that were careful and cheerful in exactly the way of someone who is protecting the people he's writing to from the truth of where he is. He had been a good man. He had been the best person she knew. And the system that was supposed to honor what he did had failed him in the particular quiet way that systems sometimes fail people, not with malice, basically, just with indifference, with the bureaucratic equivalent of a shrug. She had never been able to do anything about that. but this she could do something about. She went inside and cleaned the paint roller and set it aside for morning. Howard called on a Thursday afternoon, and the quality of his voice told her before the words did. "I've been asked to stand down," he said. "Formally." The request came through the Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office, someone with a connection to the county DA who has a connection to people I don't need to name out loud on this line. Vic was very still. "Are you standing down?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. "I'm taking the weekend to consider my options." Another pause, shorter this time. "There are federal judges who don't take calls from county DAs. It takes longer to reach them, but the path exists." She understood what he was telling her. The path existed, but it would take more time, and more time meant more days of Bud reaching for an empty pocket, more days of the harassment continuing, more days of Voss sitting in his warehouse believing that pressure and money and influence were sufficient armor against consequence. She had seen this kind of protection before, not this specific configuration, but the general architecture of it. Useful people protected by other useful people, the whole structure maintained not through any explicit agreement, but through the mutual understanding that everyone's continued usefulness depended on everyone else's. It was not corruption in the dramatic sense. It was something more ordinary, and therefore more durable, the instinct of people with something to lose to protect others who share their exposure. "How long?" she asked. "Give me until Monday." She gave him until Monday. It was the hardest thing she'd done in 2 weeks. Not the brick through the window, not the slashed tires, not the spray paint on the garage door. This, the sitting with her hands in her lap and trusting that the machinery of justice, however slow, however pressured, was still capable of turning in the right direction when pushed by the right person. It was Dex who found the next piece. He had been working the docks with the patience of someone who understands that information in those environments moves on its own schedule, that you cannot rush it, only create the conditions in which it becomes available. On Friday afternoon, he called Vic from a parking lot near the waterfront, his voice low and careful. "Got a name," he said. "The kid who was at Piper's shop, the one who asked about other buyers." Vic was very still. "Tell me." "Cody Reese." A pause. "You're going to want to know the rest." The rest was this: Cody Reese, 25 years old, had grown up in Wilmington's eastern districts in the kind of circumstances that are described in social services reports with the language of systemic factors: poverty, instability, a father who was not present for the latter half of his childhood. The father's name was Jimmy Reese. Jimmy Reese had died in 2009 in a rehabilitation facility in Durham from complications of long-term substance abuse. He had been 42 years old. Before that, he had served in the United States Army, in the Gulf, in 1991, in the 24th Infantry Division. Vic sat with this for a long time after Dex told her. She sat in her truck in the parking lot of the hardware store 3 blocks from Hank's Diner, and she sat with the particular weight of a coincidence that was not a coincidence. That was, in fact, the kind of thing that happens when you start pulling at threads. You find that the world is smaller than it appears, that the threads connect in ways that reframe everything you thought you understood about the shape of a situation. She called Bud. He answered on the first ring this time. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it before we figure out what to do with it." She told him about Jimmy Reese, about Cody, about the 24th Infantry Division in Kuwait, 1991, and the way the arithmetic of it worked out. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that she checked to make sure the call was still connected. "Jimmy Reese," Bud said finally. His voice had changed. Something in it had reconfigured, like the sudden settling of a structure that has been holding tension it didn't know it was holding. He was 24 when we deployed, youngest in the unit. Couldn't stop talking about the girl he was going to marry when he got back. Sarah. She had red hair, he said. He carried a photograph in his breast pocket. A long pause. "He got back. I don't know what happened after. We lost touch. I lost touch with most of them." "He had a hard road," Vic said carefully. "And a son." Bud said it quietly, almost to himself. "Bud, the son robbed you. He didn't know who you were, but I know." His voice was steady but worn in a new way. "I know he didn't know." A long pause. "I don't want him to go to prison, Vic." She had expected this. had expected it in the way that you expect things when you have spent enough time with a certain kind of person to understand how they process the world. That's going to be complicated, she said. I know that too. Another pause. But it's what I want. She didn't argue with him, not then. What she did after she hung up was sit for another few minutes in the parking lot thinking about fathers and sons and the ways that damage moves forward through generations, arriving in new forms, in new people who have no idea they're carrying something inherited. Then she started her truck and drove to the clubhouse. The evening meeting was shorter than usual. Garrett reported on the harassment documentation, a solid record now time-stamped and organized and ready to be handed over. Dex laid out what he had on Cody Reese, the address, the associates, the general profile of a young man operating at the low end of a subsistence economy. Vic listened and processed and added each piece to the picture. After the others had dispersed, Garrett stayed. He sat on the stool by the wall, and Vic stood at the table, and for a while neither of them said anything. This was their language, the conversation that happens in silence between people who have worked alongside each other long enough that the silence is its own form of communication. Howard's under pressure, Garrett said eventually. He's finding another path, Vic said. Federal, not local. It takes longer. Voss isn't going to stop in the meantime. No. Another silence. Outside, the night had gone full dark, and the industrial edge of town was quiet except for the distant sound of the port machinery running a ship's horn somewhere out on the water. My brother was going to be a teacher, Garrett said, quietly, unprompted. He had not, in the years she had known him, mentioned a brother before. For he enlisted, he had a year of college, was good at it. He paused. He came back different, Ed. Vic looked at him. He's fine now, Garrett added, as if preempting concern. Mostly, but there were years. He shook his head slightly. There were years. She understood what he was telling her and why he was telling her now. She understood it in the way you understand things that don't need to be explained, that arrive already whole. She thought about calling Bud again. Decided not to. It was late, and he needed sleep more than conversation. She thought about Dale's dog tag, which she wore under her shirt every day, the metal worn smooth against her skin. She had not taken it off in 20 years. She had not told anyone about it. Not Garrett, not anyone in the crew. It was private in the way that certain things are private, not hidden exactly, just kept close. She went to the back of the clubhouse, to the small office she used when she needed to think without the ambient noise of other people. She sat down. She did not turn the light on. She sat in the dark for a while, thinking about the path Howard had described, the longer road, the federal judge who didn't take calls from County D, as the patience required to let it work. Then she picked up her phone and scrolled to a number she had not called in 4 years. A number she had saved under a name that was simply 2 words, S. Merritt. Sloan Merritt was a journalist. She and Vic had worked together in a different sense of the word during Vic's EMD years. Sloan had been covering a story about emergency response services, had spent 3 shifts riding along, and they had developed the kind of friendship that emerges when people see each other in circumstances that strip away the usual social architecture. They had lost touch in the ordinary way of busy lives, and there had been a specific falling out 4 years ago over something that Vic had said and Sloan had not been ready to hear, and the line between them had gone quiet. Vic looked at the name on her phone screen for a long moment. Not yet. Howard needed his weekend. The case needed more weight. She would know when the moment was right for Sloan Merritt, and the moment was not yet. When Howard came back on Monday with his answer one way or the other, she would know which tool to reach for next. She put the phone down. But she picked it up again, not Sloan's number this time, but Bud's, and she typed a text message rather than calling because it was late and he needed sleep, and sometimes a text is the right distance. Still working, she wrote. Don't give up. We're not done. She waited. 3 minutes later, her phone buzzed. I know, he wrote back. Thank you, Vic. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up, turned the light on, and went back to work. Part 3. What's worth fighting for? The call came at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Vic was still in the office at the back of the clubhouse, a cup of coffee gone cold beside her laptop when her phone lit up with Howard's name. She picked up before the second ring. I need to meet tomorrow morning, Howard said. His voice had a particular quality to it. Not excited, Howard was never excited, but charged in the specific way of someone carrying information that has changed the shape of something. Early, the river path, 6 o'clock. I'll be there. She did not sleep much that night. Not from anxiety exactly, she had moved past anxiety into something more like the focused stillness of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing and feels it arriving. She lay in the dark of her apartment and listened to the city outside, the occasional car. The distant harbor sounds, the particular silence of a mid-November night in Wilmington that is not quite silence, just a different register of noise. She thought about the sequence of events that had brought her to this Thursday night. The diner, Bud on the floor with his hand reaching for an empty pocket, the 15 engines in the rain, 2 weeks of patient, careful work, pawn shops and dock contacts and harassment, documented and filed the slow construction of something solid enough to hold weight. She thought about Tommy Wheeler, a man she had never met whose name was engraved on the back of a medal, currently sitting in Eddie Voss's warehouse inside a crate that Voss thought made him safe. She thought about Dale. At 5:30, she got up, made fresh coffee, and rode to the river. Howard was already there when she arrived, standing at the railing where they had met 2 weeks before, watching the Cape Fear move in the early dark. He was not in running clothes this morning. He was wearing his coat, which meant this was not a casual meeting arranged around an existing routine. He had come specifically for this. She parked and walked to him, and he handed her a coffee without a word, which meant he had expected her early. The prints from the note came back, he said without preamble. Partial but enough. Matched to a man named Stuart Greer, age 41. He works logistics for Voss's warehouse operation, has for 6 years. That connects Voss directly to the envelope. It connects Voss's operation to an attempt to suppress a theft victim through financial incentive. Howard turned from the river to face her, which in the context of everything else we have is significant, but that's not the main thing. Vic waited. One of Voss's associates made a mistake 4 days ago. Howard's voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of a man who knows that the way information is delivered matters as much as the information itself. A man named Curtis Pardee. He pawned a watch at a shop in Castle Hayne. Used his real name on the ticket, apparently thought Castle Hayne was far enough outside his usual territory that it wouldn't connect. The watch matches the description of a timepiece stolen from a home on Wrightsville Beach 6 weeks ago. Same night, same address, also taken 3 other items that appear in Voss's inventory documentation from 2 weeks ago. You have the chain. I have the chain. Pardee to Voss, documented, dated, provable. Howard looked at her steadily. Combined with the harassment evidence your crew has been filing, the tires, the window, the spray paint, and the envelope from Greer, I have enough for a federal warrant application. Not local, federal, which means it bypasses the county channels entirely. Vic felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been held at a particular tension for 2 weeks, released not completely, not yet, but enough to notice. When, she asked. I filed the application yesterday afternoon with Judge Margaret Oates. She's a senior federal judge. No connection to Pell, no connection to Voss. I've worked with her before. He paused. Based on the strength of what I submitted, I expect the warrant within 48 hours, possibly sooner. And the metal. If it's in that warehouse and everything points to it being in that warehouse, it will be recovered and documented as evidence. Chain of custody maintained throughout. He met her eyes. It will get back to him, Vic. It may take a few weeks to clear evidence processing, but it will get back to him. She nodded slowly. The nodding was not a small thing. It was the physical acknowledgement of something she had promised and was now within reach of keeping. Cody Reese, she said. Howard was quiet for a moment. He's a separate matter. The theft at the diner is documented. The description matches. His connection to Voss through the Castle Street pawn shop visit is on record. Bud doesn't want him in prison. I know, you've told me. A pause. What Bud wants has weight in how the DA approaches prosecution. It doesn't determine outcome, but a victim's stated wishes, particularly in a case like this, carry significant influence. He looked out at the river. If Reese cooperates, if he provides testimony about Voss's operation, about the chain of events, from the diner to the warehouse, a prosecutorial agreement is possible. Reduced charges, possibly no incarceration depending on the specifics. He'd have to be willing to cooperate. Someone would have to ask him. Howard glanced at her sideways. Someone he might be more likely to listen to than a federal agent. She understood what he was suggesting. Give me 2 days after the warrant executes, she said. He nodded. Stay away from the warehouse until it's done. I mean it. I know you mean it. She rode back through the early morning city, the streets just beginning to populate with the first commuters, the lights of businesses switching on one by one. She felt the cold through her jacket, but didn't mind it. There is a particular quality to cold air when you are moving towards something rather than away from it, when the discomfort of the physical world is simply weather and not a condition of everything. At the clubhouse, Garrett was already there. He was making coffee, moving through the kitchen with the domestic competence of a large man who has learned to navigate small spaces without breaking things. He looked at her face when she came in and read it accurately. Good news, he said, not a question. Getting there. She sat down at the table. 48 hours, maybe less. Howard's got the warrant application in front of a federal judge. Garrett set a mug in front of her and sat down across from her. And then we wait while they execute it. And then we wait. He nodded. This was one of the things she valued about Garrett Briggs, his capacity to understand that waiting is not passive, that the restraint required to let a thing unfold correctly is itself a form of action, often the hardest form. I want to call Bud this morning, she said. Prepare him. He's been patient. He's been more than patient. She wrapped her hands around the mug. He's been carrying that empty pocket for 2 weeks and calling me every few days with that voice he uses, the one where he's trying not to ask for anything. Garrett was quiet for a moment. My brother used to do that, he said. After he came back, that same voice, like asking for something, was an imposition. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. I used to get frustrated with it, he said. I wanted him to just say what he needed. It took me too long to understand that for some people, needing something is itself the problem. The needing feels like weakness, and the weakness feels like failure, and the whole thing loops. He looked up. He doesn't need to be fixed, Vic. He just needs to see it through. She called Bud at 8 in the morning. He answered on the first ring again. We're close, she said. I can't give you details yet, but I want you to know we're within 48 hours of this moving. I need you to hold on a little longer. A pause. I've been holding on for 33 years, he said, and there was something in it that was not quite humor, but was adjacent to it, the wry, undefeated quality of a man who has learned to find the absurdity in hard things as a strategy for surviving them. She felt something move in her chest. I know, she said. I know you have. Will you? He stopped, started again. Will you be there when it happens? Yes. Okay, a breath. Okay, Vic. The warrant came through in 31 hours. Howard called at 5:17 Friday evening. 3 words, it's been signed. Vic was on her bike within 4 minutes, riding to the clubhouse, where she called a meeting that lasted exactly 12 minutes because she had already told everyone what needed to be told, and what remained was logistics. She would be there. Garrett and Dex would be there. And Bud. She had already decided about Bud. She had decided it the morning Howard first suggested 48 hours standing on the river path in the early dark. He had earned the right to be present. He had earned the right to be there when it happened, to see it with his own eyes, to not have it reported to him afterward like news from a distant country. She called him at 7 that evening. Tomorrow morning, she said, early, I'll pick you up at 5. His voice when he responded was the steadiest she had heard it in 2 weeks. I'll be ready. She was at his house on Oleander Drive at 4:58. He was standing on the porch when she pulled up, which meant he had been ready before she arrived, which meant he had probably not slept. He was wearing the olive jacket with the 24th Infantry patch, which she had expected. His hands were in his pockets, and his face was unreadable in the porch light, which she had also expected. They drove in the truck. She had brought the truck instead of the bike because the morning would be cold and long, and she wanted Bud to have the option of sitting in warmth while they waited. Garrett was already at the meeting point 3 blocks from the warehouse, parked on a side street that was empty at this hour, except for 2 of Howard's vehicles and a plainclothes officer Howard had introduced to Vic the previous evening. Dex arrived 2 minutes after them. The 4 of them stood outside the truck in the dark, the warehouse district quiet around them, the distant sounds of the port providing the only ambient noise. Fog had come in off of the river during the night and sat heavy at street level, reducing visibility to maybe 40 feet, turning the orange glow of the sodium lights into diffuse halos. Bud stood beside her and looked in the direction of the warehouse, which was not visible from here. His hands were out of his pockets, now hanging at his sides. She noticed that they were not shaking. You doing all right? She asked. Ask me in an hour, he said. Howard materialized from the fog at 5:45, moving between parked vehicles with the unhurried pace of someone who has done this before and has learned that urgency before an operation begins is wasted energy. He stopped at Vic's truck. "We're staging 2 blocks east," he said. His voice was low, not whispering. Whispering suggests anxiety, and Howard did not do anxiety. "When we move, you stay here. No closer than this position. When it's clear, I'll come to you." He looked at Bud. "We're going to get it back, sir." Bud nodded. One nod clean and complete. Howard looked at Vic. Something passed between them. Not words, just the acknowledgement of two people who have worked toward a thing and are now at the moment where the work becomes outcome. Then he walked back into the fog. They waited. The waiting had a different quality than the waiting of the past 2 weeks. That had been the waiting of process, the slow accumulation of evidence, the navigation of legal channels, the management of harassment and frustration, and Bud's quiet patience, and her own. This waiting was immediate, physical, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, that makes the hands want to move, and the feet want to shift, and the eyes want to see through things that cannot be seen through. Garrett leaned against the side of the truck. Dex had his hands in his jacket pockets. Bud stood slightly apart from the others, facing the direction he could not see, as if proximity to the warehouse in intention, if not in fact, was its own form of presence. Vic stood next to him, not speaking, not needing to. She thought about the first morning Bud on the tile floor of Hank's diner, the cloth bundle gone his hand finding empty space in his jacket pocket. She thought about the 2 weeks between that morning and this one, the accumulation of small steps and difficult restraints that had led them here to this fog-covered street, to this particular moment of convergence. She had worked emergencies for 8 years. She had stood in hospital corridors and doorways, in the backs of ambulances, and waited for outcomes that were no longer within her power to influence. She had learned through repetition and necessity that there is a kind of waiting that is its own form of action, the act of remaining present, of not abandoning the moment of being there, when the outcome arrived, so that whatever it was, it arrived into a space with a human witness. That was what she was doing now, being a witness, staying. Bud had not moved. His face was turned toward the fog. At 6:08, they heard it, distant, muffled by the bone and the distance and the general insulation of the warehouse district. A shout, then the sound of a door, heavy metal on metal. Then voices, more of them, urgent and professional. Bud's jaw tightened. Garrett straightened away from the truck. Dex pulled his hands from his pockets. Vic did not move. She was tracking the sounds with the part of her brain that had spent 8 years in emergency medicine, learning to read auditory information as a landscape. The shout was controlled, not panicked, which meant the entry had gone as planned. The voices meant people were moving, being moved. The absence of anything that sounded like violence meant the execution was clean. Then silence again. Not complete silence, the fog carried small sounds from the direction of the warehouse, the movement of people in a space, the particular audio texture of a search operation, but nothing that signified crisis. Just the methodical sound of things being done correctly. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Bud had not moved. Vic glanced at him once. His face was still unreadable, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that she recognized from her years on the road, the physical posture of someone in a waiting room. Someone who has done everything within their power to influence an outcome and has arrived at the moment where the influence ends and the outcome reveals itself. She had held the hands of people in that posture. She had sat beside them in hospital corridors, in emergency waiting areas, in the backseat of ambulances, while monitors beeped and outcomes were decided. She did not hold his hand, but she stood close enough that their arms were almost touching, and she stayed there. At 6:31, a figure appeared in the fog. Howard, walking toward them from the direction of the warehouse, his coat dark with moisture from the fog, his pace deliberate. One hand was in his coat pocket, and the other was holding something. Something small. Something that even from 30 feet away, in the diffuse light of a foggy November dawn, Vic could see was wrapped in brown paper. She heard Bud's breath change, not loudly, just a small alteration in its rhythm, the kind that happens when the body receives information before the mind has finished processing it. Howard crossed the last 20 feet and stopped in front of them. His expression was the controlled expression of a professional, but something in it had softened at the edges in the way that certain moments soften even the most disciplined faces. He held up what was in his hand. Found it in a crate in the back storage area, he said. Still wrapped. Intact. He held it out toward Bud. Bud did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it for a moment. Just looked at it, the brown paper package in Howard's extended hand in the fog-gray light of early morning with the expression of someone who is confirming that what they are seeing is real before allowing themselves to respond to it as real. Then he reached out and took it. His hands, which had not been shaking all morning, shook now, not badly, not the shaking of infirmity or weakness, the shaking of something released of a tension that has been held for so long that the body doesn't immediately know what to do with its own absence. He unwrapped the paper carefully. The brown paper fell away in pieces and then the cloth was there, the old olive cloth, the bootlace still tied in its particular knot, and Bud's hands went still. He untied the bootlace, unfolded the cloth. The Purple Heart lay in his palm. The ribbon was slightly faded, which she had known it would be. The obverse Washington's profile in relief against the heart-shaped field, the gold border was undamaged. The metal was exactly what it was, exactly what it had always been, and it caught the diffuse morning light and held it in the way that things do when they have been in the dark for a while. Bud turned it over. On the back, in the engraved letters that had been placed there by someone whose job it was to make permanent record of sacrifice, were the words that Vic had been carrying in her mind since the morning she first heard them spoken in Hank's diner. Thomas A. Wheeler. Bud closed his eyes. The fog moved around them. Somewhere in the direction of the warehouse, the sounds of the operation continued, evidence being cataloged, people being processed, the machinery of consequence turning over. Garrett stood to Vic's left, looking at nothing in particular. Dex had his face turned slightly away. Howard stood with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and he was wise enough to know it. Bud's shoulders moved. Small movements, the movement of someone breathing through something rather than stopping it. He did not make a sound. He stood in the November fog with the metal in his palms and his eyes closed, and 33 years of carrying something in a place that had been emptied for 2 weeks, and he let the weight of it settle back into its rightful place. Vic put her hand on his shoulder. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would improve the moment, and she had learned a long time ago that the impulse to fill silence with words is often about the speaker's discomfort rather than the listener's need. She stood with her hand on his shoulder, and she thought about Dale, about the dog tag under her shirt, the metal worn smooth against her skin, about the medal that was never awarded and the commendation that stopped moving through the machinery and the particular kind of loss that has no ceremony around it, no moment of return, no morning in the fog where someone hands you back what was taken. She felt the edge of that, felt it, the way you feel heat from a distance, not burning, but present, real. When Bud opened his eyes, they were wet. He looked at the metal in his hands for another moment, then he looked at Vic. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough but steady, the voice of a man arriving on the other side of something. She shook her head slightly. Dale would have done the same. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes come out, without preamble, without the usual architecture of disclosure, just present and then said. Bud looked at her, really looked at her the way he had looked at the metal, checking that what he was seeing was real before responding to it as real. "Your brother," he said, "Sergeant Dale Decker." She kept her voice level. "Fallujah, November 2004. A pause. "He was put in for a commendation. The paperwork stopped moving. He never got his medal." The silence between them had a different quality now. Not just the silence of a shared moment, but the silence of two people who have found in an unexpected place someone else who understands the specific geography of what they carry. "I'm sorry," Bud said. "So am I." She looked at the metal in his hands. "That's why this mattered." He nodded slowly. Then he did something she had not expected. He reached up and put his hand briefly over hers on his shoulder, just for a moment, just to touch, the gesture of someone acknowledging a presence that has been steady when steadiness was required. Then he let his hand drop. "You said you'd get it back," he said. "I did. You kept your word, Vic." The fog was beginning to thin at its edges, the first dilute light of dawn working through it from the east. Howard had moved aside and was on his phone, the operation continuing around the edges of this moment without disturbing it. Garrett had walked a few steps away and was looking at the street. Dex was doing the same thing in the other direction, the instinctive courtesy of people giving someone room without being asked. Howard came back to them phone in hand. Voss is in custody, two of his associates as well, including the man whose prints were on that envelope. We found stolen property from at least 14 separate incidents in the warehouse. This is a significant case. He paused. The connection to Warren Pell, we found documents in the office, physical documents that Voss had apparently been accumulating for some time. He looked at Vic steadily. Your instinct about the leverage angle was right. He was holding the metal and those documents as insurance against Pell. It's going to open an investigation that extends well beyond this morning. Vic received this without visible reaction. And Cody Reese, he's one of three individuals we're looking at for the diner incident. The investigation is ongoing. Howard looked at Bud. Mr. Calloway, I've been informed of your wishes regarding the young man. I can't make promises about prosecution outcomes, but your statement will carry significant weight. If he cooperates with the federal investigation, and given what we found this morning, his cooperation would be valuable. There are paths forward that don't involve incarceration. Bud nodded slowly. I'd like to speak with him before anything else happens, if that's possible. Howard considered this. I'll see what I can arrange. 3 days after the warrant executed, a story ran in the Wilmington Star-News under Sloan Merritt's byline. It was careful and precise and sourced in the way that good journalism is sourced. No names it couldn't prove, no claims it couldn't support, but the shape of what it described was unmistakable. A Senate candidate, a Gulf War procurement record, a warehouse full of stolen property, and one item in particular that had never been meant to be there. The story moved quickly, picked up by the wire services, by afternoon national outlets, by evening, the kind of story that travels because it contains several things people cannot look away from simultaneously. Vic read it at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. She did not call Sloan. The story said everything that needed saying. Some debts don't require acknowledgement to be real. She simply sat with the paper in her hands and felt for the first time in 2 weeks that the full weight of the situation had found its proper resting place. The meeting with Cody Reese was arranged 4 days after the warrant in a room at the Federal Building that had the institutional blankness of spaces designed for difficult conversations. Vic drove Bud there and waited in the corridor. She did not ask him afterward what was said in that room. She had decided not to ask, had made the decision on the drive over because some things are between people and the people alone, and asking about them is a kind of intrusion even when it comes from genuine care. What she observed when Bud came out of the room was that he looked like a man who had set something down. Not happy exactly, not relieved in any simple sense, but lighter in the way that people are lighter when they have done something difficult that needed to be done. He was carrying a photograph when he came out. She recognized it, the old photograph from the diner, the two young men in desert fatigues, the one laughing at the camera. He had taken it from his pocket and brought it in and left it there. Jimmy Reese was a good man, he said in the elevator. He had a bad road after he came home. That happens. He was quiet for a moment. His son has his eyes. She drove him back to Oleander Drive. He invited her in for coffee, and she accepted because the accepting seemed right, and the kitchen with its refrigerator, covered in photographs, was exactly as she had remembered it. They sat at the kitchen table. The single chair had been joined by a second one from somewhere retrieved from another room in preparation for her visit, and this small act of preparation moved her in a way she couldn't quite name. They drank their coffee. He told her about Tommy Wheeler. Not the abbreviated version she had heard in the diner, the full version, the story that had 33 years of being carried behind it. Tommy Wheeler from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who had a younger sister named Grace and a girlfriend named Patty, and a way of laughing that filled whatever space he occupied. Tommy Wheeler, who had enlisted at 19 because he wanted to, because he believed in something, because he was that kind of person. Tommy Wheeler, who had been 23 years old in January of 1991 and had made a decision in a fraction of a second that Bud had spent 33 years trying to make worth something. He wasn't the kind of person you could easily explain to someone who didn't know him, Bud said. He was looking at the window at the afternoon light coming through it. Some people you can summarize. Here are the facts of them, here's who they were. Tommy wasn't like that. He was specific, particular. He had opinions about things that most people didn't bother having opinions about. He had a whole theory about the best kind of weather for fishing that he'd explain to anyone who'd listen. A small pause. And he'd saved my life twice before that last day in ways I've never told anyone. Small things. Being in the right place. Noticing something I'd missed. He was that kind of person, the kind who quietly kept the people around him alive without making any production of it. He was quiet for a moment. The coffee sat between them, still warm. "The medal isn't about me," he said again. "I want to be clear about that. It never was. I was the one who got hit. Tommy was the one who moved without thinking because moving was what you did when someone you cared about was in the way of something. That's it. That's the whole story." He looked up. "The medal is the proof that the story happened, that it was real, that a 23-year-old kid from Tulsa with a theory about fishing weather made a choice that mattered, and that somebody somewhere put his name on a piece of metal to say so." "I found Grace," Bud said. "About 10 years ago, Tommy's sister. She lives in Austin now, has kids. I wrote to her, sent her a copy of the citation, the one that came with the medal." He paused. "She wrote back. We still correspond a couple times a year." Vic was quiet. "She said something in her first letter that I've thought about a lot since then," Bud continued. He was looking at the coffee mug. "She said that knowing what Tommy did, knowing the specific thing, not just that he served, but what he did at the end of it, gave her something to hold on to. She said it made him more real, not less. Because before, after so many years, she was worried she was starting to lose the specific person of him in her memory. The medal and what it represented gave him back to her in a way." He looked up at Vic. "That's why it matters," he said. "Not for me, I know what he did. I don't need a piece of metal to remember it." He paused. "It's for the people who didn't see it. The people who need to know it happened. The proof that it was real." Vic looked at her coffee cup. Her hand moved without her quite deciding it should to the collar of her shirt. She pulled out the dog tag, set it on the table between them. Dale Decker, his serial number, his blood type. The small facts of a person reduced to metal for practical military purposes, for the identification of bodies, for the logistics of a system that processes human beings at scale. Bud looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. He had just told her in the story of Grace Wheeler exactly why she still wore it. He nodded. Once. The complete nod of a person who understands. She tucked the dog tag back under her shirt. They finished their coffee. She drove back to the clubhouse through the Saturday afternoon city past the hardware store and the laundromat past Hank's Diner where the lights were on and Carol was moving between tables and Pete was at the grill. The Saturday barbecue had been Garrett's idea, which surprised her until she thought about it, and then it didn't surprise her at all. It was exactly the kind of gesture that Garrett made when he wasn't talking the action that said what the words didn't. Bud arrived at the clubhouse at 2 in the afternoon in his truck wearing the olive jacket. He stood at the entrance to the garage for a moment. Just stood there taking in the space, the smell of it, the 15 people distributed through it in various attitudes of ease, the music from somewhere, the smoke from the grill Garrett had set up in the lot behind the building. The space was not what he had imagined. He had imagined without quite realizing he was imagining it something darker and more intimidating, the movie version of a place like this, all shadows and menace. What he found instead was a garage that smelled like motor oil and barbecue smoke, and had mismatched chairs arranged around tables that had been dragged out into the afternoon light, and people who looked in this context like people. That was the thing about meeting people in their own spaces. It collapsed the versions of them you had assembled from a distance. These were not 15 leather-jacketed abstractions. They were people who had a cook who burned the first batch of burgers and accepted the resulting ribbing with the good humor of someone who had been here before. They were people who had a running argument about baseball that apparently dated back years and had outlasted the original disagreement. They were people who had, for reasons that had nothing to do with Bud Calloway and everything to do with who they were, decided 2 weeks ago that something mattered and had acted accordingly. Vic met him at the door. "Come in," she said, and he came in. The afternoon moved in the way good afternoons move, not rushing, not performing, just being. Someone brought Bud a beer and then another. He sat in the folding chair someone had placed for him near the grill, and people moved through his orbit with the easy naturalness of a group that has decided someone belongs, and belonging requires no ceremony. He talked to Brixton for 20 minutes about trucks. He talked to Dex about the Cape Fear River and the best spots to fish, which Dex knew because Dex knew everything about Wilmington's geography. He talked to a woman named Clara who had been riding since she was 17 and had the stories to prove it. At some point in the late afternoon, Vic sat down in the chair beside him. The light had gone golden the way November light does in the late afternoon, and the smoke from the grill was going straight up in the still air, which meant the weather was settling. "How are you doing?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm doing better than I've done in a while," he said, "which is not nothing." She looked at him. He had the purple heart on him. She could tell from the way he held himself, the slight ease of a man who has a familiar weight back in its proper place. Not visible, not displayed, just there in the inside pocket of the olive jacket where it belonged. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said, "about Dale, about why it matters. You don't have to. I want to." He looked at her steadily. "You gave me 2 weeks of your time. Your crew gave their tires and their sleep and took harassment without hitting back because you asked them not to. The least I can do is be honest with you." She waited. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Since Margaret, before Margaret in some ways. Combat does something to a man's interior geography, makes some parts of it hard to reach for other people, and sometimes for yourself." He paused. "I got used to it. The alone. Told myself it was preference." She didn't say anything. "It wasn't preference," he said. "It was just the shape of things after a while. You live in a shape long enough, you stop noticing you are in it." He looked out at the lot, at the people moving through the barbecue afternoon. "Today I noticed," she followed his gaze. Garrett at the grill decks in conversation with Clara Brixton, laughing at something that must have been genuinely funny. The ease of it. The ordinary human ease of people in a space together. "You're not a stranger here anymore," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not." Later, when the afternoon had thinned into evening and people were beginning to drift toward their bikes, Bud stood and thanked people with the straightforward directness of a man who means what he says and doesn't elaborate beyond meaning. Garrett shook his hand. Dex clapped him on the shoulder. Clara told him he'd better come back. At the door, he turned to Vic. He reached into the inside pocket of the olive jacket. He took out the cloth bundle, the metal wrapped in its bootlace, and he held it for a moment, and then he held it out toward her. She looked at it. "Not to keep," he said. He paused. "I want you to hold it for a second. I want you to know what it feels like." She took it carefully. It was lighter than she expected and heavier than made sense the way certain things are, the physical weight, modest the other weight beyond calculation. The cloth was worn soft with years of handling. Through it, she could feel the shape of the metal, the slight relief of the surface. She thought about Dale, about the commendation that was never finalized, the metal that never existed, the paperwork that stopped moving in the machinery of a system that had more pressing things to attend to. She thought about what Bud had said about Grace Wheeler, that having the specific thing, the physical proof, had given her brother back to her. She handed it back. He took it, wrapped it in the cloth, tucked it into the inside pocket of the olive jacket, pressing it against his chest for just a moment with the flat of his hand before letting go. "Thank you, Vic," he said. She looked at him. "Any time, Bud." He walked out to his truck. She stood at the entrance to the garage and watched him go. The deliberate, careful walk of a man who has been through more than most people will ever see on a map, who has carried things that most people will never be asked to carry, who went home tonight with what he'd come to the diner that Tuesday morning, with the evidence that something real had happened, that someone had stood beside him and not looked away. She heard the truck start, watched the headlights come on. She pulled the dog tag from under her shirt, held it in her palm for a moment, the metal warm from being against her skin. She put it back. She went inside, back into the light and the noise and the ordinary, extraordinary life of the clubhouse on a Saturday evening where Garrett was washing grill equipment and Dex was arguing cheerfully about something inconsequential, and the music from somewhere was just loud enough to fill the space without overwhelming the conversation. She sat down at the table, not working for once, just sitting. The coffee Garrett set in front of her went slightly cold while she held it, and she let it because the moment did not require anything from her except to be in it. This was the thing that she had not anticipated when she crouched beside a stranger on the floor of Hank's diner 2 weeks ago and waited for him to find his balance. She had anticipated the logistics, the investigation, the legal channels, the patience required to do it correctly. She had anticipated the slashed tires, the broken window, the spray paint on the garage door. She had even anticipated the emotional weight of it, the way certain things resonate with the private frequencies of your own life, whether you invite them to or not. She had not anticipated feeling at the end of it that something in her own interior geography had shifted. Not resolved, that was too clean a word for what Dale's absence would always be, but shifted. Like a compass needle that has been sitting in the same position for so long that you've stopped noticing it, and then one day it moves. The Cape Fear moved in the dark beyond the city. The fog that had sat over the warehouse district 3 mornings ago had long since lifted. Somewhere on Oleander Drive, a truck pulled into a driveway and a porch light came on. Somewhere in the federal system, the case against Eddie Voss and the investigation into Warren Pell's Gulf War record were moving forward through the machinery of consequence, slow and grinding and eventually conclusive in the way that such things are when built correctly, when the evidence holds. Sloan Merritt's story was still moving through the national news cycle, finding readers in places Wilmington rarely reached, the kind of story that travels because it carries several truths at once, and people recognize each of them separately. And in a room in the federal building that smelled like institutional carpet and old coffee, a young man named Cody Reese was deciding whether to cooperate, holding a photograph of a man he had never known, but whose eyes he had inherited, a man who had served beside the man he had robbed and had his own hard road and his own losses and his own shape that the world had pressed him into without asking permission. The world kept its rhythm. The city kept turning. In the small human spaces within it, things had been made right that could be made right, and the things that couldn't be made right had been sat with and named and carried forward by people who understood that carrying is not the same as being crushed. That was enough. That was on the best days everything.